Good afternoon. Today I'm going to read to you about picture number 1 of the 10 Rosarium pictures. Now, just to remind you, the 10 Rosarium pictures, which are from 1550, from a book called the Rosarium Philosophorum by Gerhard Dorn, represent the psychological process of various entities. Okay, and so Dr. Edinger was talking about an individual, also about a couple, and then also about a group. And so this process goes through all of those alchemical cauldrons, let's say, the vase. And so, as Edinger says here, the more familiar one becomes with alchemical symbolism, the more evident it is that the alchemical images apply to everything. They're operative everywhere. So if one is going to use the imagery for understanding a certain experience or phenomenon, one does need to define the vessel that a given alchemical process is taking place in. And the 3 most common vessels are the ones I've mentioned here: the individual psyche, a relationship between 2 people, and a process going on in a larger group. Now, before I begin discussing this first image, the Mandala Fountain, I'm going to follow a tradition that relates to all good public speaking. And that tradition is tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. And so to begin with, I'm going to go to this book, The Mysterium Lectures by Edward Edinger. And so in the main book that I'm reading from, which is this book, The Mystery of the Coniunctio, Alchemical Images for Individuation, and again, here you see the Mundell of Fountain. In this section on picture 1, Dr. Edinger kind of sloughs off a discussion of a part of this. And so I'm going to begin from the end. So from the Mysterium Lectures, this is basically bringing up a footnote, and it will help you understand where we're going. So I'm starting at the end of what I'll be reading later. And Dr. Edinger says, I'm on page 284 of the Mysterium Lectures. He says, and here's the punchline: the psychic is a phenomenal world in itself, which can be reduced neither to the brain nor to metaphysics. That means, on the one hand, that the psyche cannot be explained by biochemistry, and on the other, that it cannot be explained by metaphysical, religious, dogmatic formulations of any brand or creed whatsoever. It is a separate world of being, and the only reason attempts are made to explain it in terms of biochemistry or metaphysics is because the explainers who make the attempt are not aware of the existence, the reality of the psyche as a separate world of being. The very effort to explain it by those alternative means demonstrates that the psyche as a reality is invisible to the would-be explainers. Now let me back up to the top of that page and read a little bit further here. Just put my chat here where I can see it. Hello, Eric. How are you? Nice to see you, and thank you for the compliment. Terrific. I hope you'll join our advanced reading group then. Okay, so now I'm going to up to the top of that page, and this is, I'm reading from this book, which is The Mysterium Lectures by Edward F. Edinger. I'm on page 284. But the soul's purposes are symbolic ones, and if the soul slips up and makes the body serve these purposes, act them out literally, then there will be disappointment. Experiences like that force one to reflect about the 10,000 things and their attractive and deceptive glamour. It leads then to in Jung's words, to introversion, introspection, meditation, and the careful investigation of desires and their motives. I should add that such experiences, keeping with that and the 10,000 things, let me just briefly remind you of this image. Nope, doesn't want to come up. Okay. It's there, but oh, there it is. Okay. All right, so let me remind you of this image. This is a 63-foot motor yacht that is sitting idle in the marina that's next to my condominium complex. And as you see, this is one of the 10,000 things that was, a bauble that this fellow wanted. And then after he got it, he's not using it. It's sitting there idle. And so that's what Dr. Edinger is talking about. Okay. So if you get something like that and and then you don't use it, you should be introverting and meditating upon why you did that. He says, I should add that such experiences happen not only with things like shoes and cars and television sets, they also happen with personal relationships. One could get married on such a basis. Marry in haste and repent at leisure. I think there might be a few of us that have such experiences. I want to end with Jung's important remarks in paragraph 667. Now here he's referring to paragraph 667 of Mysterium Coniunctionis. So I'll read that. One should not be put off by the physical impossibilities of dogma or of the Coniunctio, for they are symbols in regard to which the allurements of rationalism are entirely out of place and miss the mark. If symbols mean anything at all, they are tendencies which pursue a definite but not yet recognizable goal, and consequently can express themselves only in analogies. In this uncertain situation, one must be content to leave things as they are and give up trying to know anything beyond the symbol. In the case of dogma, such as renunciation is such a renunciation is reinforced by the fear of possibly violating the sanctity of a religious idea, and in the case of alchemy, it was until very recently considered not worthwhile to rack one's brains over medieval absurdities. Today, armed with psychological understanding, we are in a position to penetrate into the meaning of even the most abstruse alchemical symbols, and there is no justifiable reason why we should not apply the same method to dogma. Nobody, after all, can deny that it consists of ideas which are born of man's imagining and thinking. The question of how far this thinking may be inspired by the Holy Ghost is not affected at all. let alone decided, by psychological investigation, nor is the possibility of a metaphysical background denied. Psychology cannot advance any argument either for or against the objective validity of any metaphysical view. I have repeated this statement in various places in order to give the lie to the obstinate and grotesque notion that a psychological explanation must necessarily be either psychologism or its opposite, namely a metaphysical assertion. And here's the punchline. The psychic is a phenomenal world in itself, which can be reduced neither to the brain nor to metaphysics. That means, on the one hand, that the psyche cannot be explained by biochemistry, and on the other, that it cannot be explained by metaphysical, religious, dogmatic formulations of any brand or creed whatsoever. It is a separate world of being, and the only reason attempts are made to explain it in terms of biochemistry or metaphysics is because the explainers who make the attempt are not aware of its existence, the reality of the psyche as a separate world of being. The very effort to explain it by those alternative means demonstrates that the psyche as a reality is invisible to the would-be explainers. Okay, so that's kind of the punchline. That's how this whole thing ends. But now I want to go back to the discussion of the actual image for today, which is it this one? This one. Okay, there it should be. Sorry, my camera gets in my way. All right, so there is the image for today. And so now I'm reading Mysterium Coniunctio, or the Mystery of the Coniunctio, Alchemical Image of Individuation. And so, mind you, the Rosarium Philosophorum has 10 images, which I'll be reading over the next several days. And they represent a psychological cycle or process that can be either in an individual, in a relationship between two individuals, or in an entire group. Hi, Buzz. Welcome. Okay, now. So now I'm going to read Dr. Edinger's discussion in this book, The Mystery of the Coniunctio. Picture 1, the Mundell of Fountain. Here we have a picture of a fountain with a kind of flower-like decoration on top of it. From it, 3 pipes spout a fluid into a containing basin. It is surrounded by an approximately square structure with a 2-headed serpent at the top, each head spouting a vapor. That's a reference to an ancient idea that the 4 elements first derived from 2 vapors. Initially, there were 2 vapors, a smoky vapor and a watery vapor. The smoky vapor divided into 2, becoming earth and air, and the watery vapor divided into 2, fire and water. You can see that the 2 vapors spit out by the serpent then generate 4 6-pointed stars, 1 in each of the 4 corners. Those signify the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water. There is a 5th star in the center, which signifies the quintessence or 5th entity created by the unification of the 4 elements. And then on either side are the sun and moon. This picture represents both the prima materia and the ultima materia. It's really outside the sequence. It belongs just as much at the end as at the beginning. It's alpha and omega, representing both ends of the process. This is the so-called mercurial fountain. The fountain of Mercury Mercurius, the fountain of Mercurius, and psychologically it would signify the foundation of the psyche prior to the birth of the ego. In the earliest stages of development, in youth, the ego lives to a large extent in identification with what this picture symbolizes. The fountain spurts out its life-giving fluids without much trouble because there's no reflection yet. But in later life, in the process of individuation, the ego is obliged to relate to what this picture represents and live it out consciously. I would draw to your attention the fact that the images are cosmic, stars, sun, and moon, inorganic, represented by the four elements and vapors, and reptilian. This is what the foundation of the human psyche is. It's of that nature. There's nothing human about it. It isn't even mammalian. It doesn't even have the degree of connection with us that warm blood would give. An image such as this is very often an end product of analysis. Usually it doesn't show up at the beginning at all, except in cases where the need is to analyze one out of the unconscious state rather than into it. I just draw your attention to how much is condensed into this picture. For instance, built into it is the symbolic sequence 1, 2, 3, 4. There's one fountain in the center, but just above it are two representations of duality, the sun and the moon on the one hand, and the two-headed serpent on the other. The number 3 is built into the picture by the 3 spouts in the fountain. They are labeled virgin's milk, vinegar. They are labeled virgin's milk, vinegar of the fountain, and water of life. These are various synonyms for the elixir, the aqua permanens, the liquid version of the philosopher's stone. The quaternity is represented by the 4 stars in the corners, symbolizing the 4 elements. Even the number 5 is alluded to by the 5th star. Okay. Now this sequence of 1, 2, 3, 4 is the so-called axiom of Maria. It's very important for Jung. So when I was thinking about this, I said to myself, let's just see how often he refers to it. So I looked it up in the index of the collected works and found 36 references to the axiom of Maria. And let's see if I can show you. So, speaking of Maria, here's Maria Prophetessa, who was a 3rd century alchemist, very advanced for her time, considering she was a woman and she was a mathematician. And so I'll leave that aside for now. Maria Prophetessa, Maria the Jewess, was a famous early alchemist. She was a kind of ancestress of the alchemists. Her axiom is this: 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, and out of the 3rd comes the 1 as the 4th. And there's another version: 1 and it is 2, 2 and it is 3, 3 and it is 4, and 4 and it is 3, and 3 and it is 2, and 2 and it is 1. You know, the more one reflects on the first simple integers, the more mysterious and significant they become. The axiom of Maria corresponds to the ancient Pythagorean Tetrakis, Tetrakis, which is represented like this. I'll show you that. Okay, so that's the ancient Pythagorean Tetrakis. The Brotherhood of Pythagoreans worshipped the Tetrakis as their most sacred emblem. They were living at a time when numbers were just being discovered. The numinosity of the numbers and the relationship between numbers gripped these early discoverers profoundly. They were in such close touch with the archetypal background of the numbers that its sacred aura was immediately perceptible to them. We have to work very hard to get back into that state of mind, and in order to do so, we must go down into the unconscious. Pythagorean philosophy still lives in our unconscious, and if we go down deeply enough, then the numinosity of those original things starts to grip us also. This sort of thing is all built into this first picture. The alchemists still had some feeling for these qualities, but we've very largely lost it. Jung says somewhere that the first five simple integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, are the basis of the whole cosmogony. If we had more time, I would run through this double axiom of Maria and show you how it represents the psychological development of both the first and second half of life. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, 3 becomes 4, 4 becomes 3, 3 becomes 2, 2 becomes 1. Down and back up again, from unity down to fourfold multiplicity, and then back in steps up to unity. That's a symbolic resume of the first and second halves of life. I don't have time to go into it now, but maybe that's sufficient to give you a hint so that you can figure it out for yourselves. And at this point, he gives the footnote to the Mysterium Lectures, Lecture 23, which I'm going to read in just a moment. So he didn't have time to read it, but I'm going to do it. Now, as we go through each picture, I want to mention at least briefly how such images also come up in modern dreams. This first picture would correspond to mandala structures. The circle and the square, let me put the first picture back up. Okay. This first picture would correspond to mandala structures, the circle and the square, the fountain, the numbers, and especially the very common dream images referring to the theme of the 3 and the 4. These are images that come up as unifying symbols in the analytic process, and although they're often an end product of a phase of development, they can sometimes come up early as a foreshadowing of future integration. Okay, so that is the end of his discussion of image number 1 in this book, The Mystery of the Coniunctio. But now, more significantly, I want to go back to this discussion of the Tetrakis in the Mysterium Lectures. And so in the Mysterium Lectures, I'm starting on page 275, which is part 2, called The Conjunction. The major part of this chapter examines various texts of Gerhard Dorn concerning the Threefold Kinyuen. But first, to prepare the way, Jung quotes a text from the Hermetic Museum. That's in paragraph 655. Now, this is paragraph 655 of Mysterium Coniunctionis. But to make it a little clearer, I'm going to read you a slightly fuller version. Here it is, a symbolic description of the threefold process that introduces the rest of the chapter. Quote, "The three principles of things are produced out of the four elements in the following manner. Nature, whose power is in her obedience to the will of God, ordained from the very beginning that the four elements should incessantly act on one another. So, in obedience to her behest, fire began to act on air and produced sulfur. Air acted on water and produced mercury. Water, by its action on earth, produced salt. Earth alone, having nothing to act upon, did not produce anything, but became the nurse or womb of these three principles, i.e., sulfur, mercury, and salt." Now, mind you, this is not a chemical description of how sulfur, mercury, and salt are created, but it was the alchemical point of view. Okay, going on with this quote. "Whoever would be a student of this sacred science must know the marks whereby these three principles are to be recognized, and also the process by which they are developed. For as the three principles are produced out of four, so they, in their turn, must produce two, a male and a female, and these two must produce an incorruptible one, in which are exhibited the four elements in a highly purified and digested condition, and with their mutual strife hushed in unending peace and goodwill. I've made a chart to represent what's being referred to in figure 23.1. So let me give you figure 23.1. Okay, so there it is. I've made a chart to represent what's being referred to, figure 23.1. The four elements, fire, air, water, and earth, one on top of the other. Fire works on air and generates sulfur. Air works on water and generates mercury. Water works on earth and generates salt. These are basically number symbols, so this text is an allusion to the axiom of Maria, which concerns the whole matter of 4 and 3. There are several versions of the axiom of Maria. One goes like this: 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, and out of the third comes the 1 as the fourth. Another version reads this way: 1 and it is 2, 2 and it is 3, and 3 and it is 4, and 4 and it is 3, and 3 and it is 2, and 2 it is 1. So they go 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 3, 2, 1. This symbolism of the first four numbers of the arithmetic series has an ancient and venerable origin. It goes back to the Pythagorean Tetrakis. Okay. A sacred symbol represented thus: 4 rows of pebbles, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so that's it. Here are some things Walter Burckhardt has to say about the Ancient Tetrakis. The kernel of Pythagorean wisdom is the Tetrakis, or 4 group, made up of the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, which add up to 10. They are represented in a pebble figure in the form of a perfect triangle. These 4 numbers contain not only the basic intervals, 4th, 5th, octave, and double octave, but also point, line, plane, and solid. The Tetrakis, a tetrad made up of unequal numbers, is a cryptic formula only comprehensible to the initiated. The word inevitably reminds us of the trichtis, the triad of different sacrificial animals, as the sacrificial art of the seer involving the shedding of blood, superseded by a higher bloodless secret. There is perhaps a hint toward an explanation in the text that says, "What is the oracle of Delphi?" The Tetrakis, that is, the harmony in which the sirens sing. The later tradition is more explicit. The tetrad of the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, which add up to 10, the perfect triangle, contains within itself at the same time the harmonic ratios of fourth, fifth, and octave. The sirens produce the music of the spheres. The whole universe is harmony and number. The Tetrakis has within it the secret of the world, and in this matter, we can also understand the connection with Delphi, the seat of the highest and most secret wisdom. Later sources speak of the mysterious ringing of the bronze tripod of Apollo. The meaning of the shibboleth or symbolon, Tetrakis, can only be explained in a tentative fashion. In place of that which was connected with it from the beginning in the form of belief or experience, the later sources give us more and more rationalizations. Some way or other, the secret of the world is to be found in number. Well, that gives you just a little sense of the sacred numinosity the ancients attached to the symbol of the Tetrakis. Now I want to examine this image a little more carefully in relation to the four elements and the three principles. And I want to link it with the discussion running through this final chapter of the Threefold Kinyuen. So before I speak about some of the psychological implications of the Tetrakis, let me say a few words about what the Threefold Kinyuen is and what it means. Jung doesn't make it too clear. He's not interested in simplifying what he presents, but leaves that to others to do. He makes us work a little. The three stages of the Coniunctio are announced in a text of Dorn's that Jung quotes in paragraph 663 of Mysterium Coniunctionis. Quote, "We conclude that meditative philosophy consists in the overcoming of the body by mental unio mentalis. This first union does not, as yet, make the wise man, but only the mental disciple of wisdom. The second union of the mind with the body shows forth the wise man, hoping for and expecting the blessed third union with the first unity, i.e., the unus mundus, the latent unity of the world. May Almighty God grant that all men be made such, and may He be one in all." As you see, that's not very clear, but in the essence of the three stages of the Coniunctio are as follows. Read that again. As you see, that's not very clear, but in essence, the three stages of the Coniunctio are as follows. Stage 1 is called the unio mentalis, which means mental union. It refers to the union of the soul and the spirit, which are separated from the body. The idea is that the organism is composed of three entities, body, soul, and spirit, and at the beginning they are all mixed up with one another. The first stage of the Coniunctio, the unio mentalis, brings about the union of soul and spirit over and against the body. They link up as partners and go against the body. In the second stage, the united spirit and soul, which were previously separated from the body, are now reunited with the body. They say, in effect, we love you after all, so you can come back and join us. That's the unio mentalis united with the body. The third, unus mundus, refers to yet another union, the united spirit-soul-body, achieved in the second stage, is now united with the world. That union brings about the unus mundus. We'll be talking about those three stages in further detail as we go along, but because the same symbolism is embedded in the imagery of the Tetrakis, I want to just lay them out so you get a general idea of what they refer to. Since this image of the Tetrakis was invested with such sacred meaning by the ancients, I think we can assume it carries some pretty important symbolism and psychologically is worth our consideration. I'm going to offer you certain reflections of my own about its meaning. These are tentative efforts to sketch out what may lie behind the Tetrakis, but what I have to say does not by any means exhaust the symbolic meaning of this image. But what I have to say does not by any means exhaust the symbolic meaning of this image. Apply your own creative reflections and see what your unconscious comes up with. Among other things, the Tetrakis can be considered as an epitome of the process of psychological development and as an analogy to the three stages of Coniunctio. As indicated in my chart 23.4, give you that. So, as indicated in my chart 23.4, I think the process of psychological development as twofold. First, a movement down through the sequence of numbers, and second, a movement back up through the sequence. You can see how he envisions it. We can think of the sequence as having 4 stages and 3 steps of transition. The original condition, stage 1, would be represented by that single little pebble at the top, which would signify the state of original wholeness before any consciousness enters the picture. Then an event takes place, transition step A, which leads to a split, something like cell division. The original self divides into 2, corresponding to the theme of the separation of the world parents. This brings about stage 2, the beginning of ego development, which is characterized by the separation of subject and object. Here the ego begins to experience itself as separate from the world while still being caught in the polarity between nature and spirit. The next transition, step B, is full separation from the mother, nature. This leads to stage 3, autonomous, independent thinking. Transition step C then brings about the separation from the father, spirit. This leads to stage 4, which is characterized by independent, autonomous being, a state where original unity has been differentiated into a fourfold multiplicity, and the individual is living fully in the world. Eventually, this 4th stage, living in the world, begins to pall, and as Jung puts it in paragraph 657 of Mysterium Coniunctionis, Quote, the four elements begin to fall apart, as it were, in four directions. As the four elements represent the whole cyclical world, their falling apart means dissolution into the constituents of the world, that is, into a purely inorganic and hence unconscious state. Conversely, the combination of the elements in the final synthesis of male and female is an achievement of the art and a product of conscious endeavor. The result of the synthesis was consequently conceived by the adept as self-knowledge, which, like the knowledge of God, is needed for the preparation of the philosopher's stone. Piety is needed for the work, and this is nothing but knowledge of oneself. So at a certain point, when one has achieved a full life in the world, and in a certain sense, full psychic differentiation, the inadequacy of that state of being becomes more and more manifest. Then the four elements start falling apart, and the specific task of individuation is activated. This task of individuation can be thought of as an ascent back up through the number series of the Tetrakis. The event that must take place to ascend from level 4 to level 3 is the first stage of the Coniunctio, namely the Unio Mentalis. That would correspond to a reductive analysis of the shadow, a mortificatio. Here is what Jung has to say in paragraphs 671 and 672 about this process of Unio Mentalis, the first stage of the Coniunctio that corresponds to moving back up from level 4 to level 3. Quote, but in order to bring about their subsequent reunion, the mind must be separated from the body, which is equivalent to voluntary death, but only separated things can unite. By this separation, Dorn obviously meant a discrimination and dissolution of the composite state being one in which the affectivity of the body was a disturbing influence on the rationality of the mind. The aim of this separation was to free the mind from the influence of the bodily appetites and the heart's affections, and to establish a superior position which is superordinate to the turbulent sphere of the body. This leads at first to a dissociation of the personality and a violation of the merely natural man, and a violation of the nearly natural man. Okay, as often happens in these readings, it's starting to hypnotize me. Sorry. I'm going to rest my eyes a little bit by looking at your chats. Buzz says, I wondered for some years if learning maths is a kind of alchemy. For when I've learned a principle, it seems as if it's always been there. Yes, I think it is. And, I remember when I was in the 4th grade, the teacher was teaching us long division, and she would describe the problem to us, and I could just see the answer. I just knew the answer. And I didn't have to go through all the math that everybody went through. And I remember at that point we were tested to see what our level was in mathematics. And I was already at the 8th grade level. I was testing at the 8th grade level, even though I was in the 4th grade. And even though I was at that time in a 2-room schoolhouse in the middle of a field in the fruit belt of Michigan. But anyway, so these things are out there, and the psyche does pick up on them, even though even though that's not how we're taught. So as I said, the teacher would, give an answer like 96 divided by 16 or something like that, and I would just see the answer. I can't do that anymore naturally, but so I have no idea what the answer to that particular long division problem is, but nonetheless, that's how it was when I was 10 years old, I guess. Okay. So going on with this quote, this preliminary step in itself, a clear blend of Stoic philosophy and Christian psychology, is indispensable for the differentiation of consciousness. Modern psychotherapy makes use of the same procedure when it objectifies the effects and instincts and confronts consciousness with them. That puts it all very concisely, and as you go along, if you have trouble understanding just what this unio mentalis really is, I suggest you reread and reflect on these 2 paragraphs. So the unio mentalis brings about a state where the ego is separated from the unconscious and able to take an objective and critical attitude toward effects and desirousness. The spirit and soul are joined together and separated from the body. When this is achieved, level 3 of the ascent is reached. So presumably this means that you might have a vision of having that wonderful boat, and yet you're able to step back from your vision and see that, is that really going to make me happy? Am I going to really be able to go out on that boat or not? That's the kind of critical attitude or objective attitude that you would be taking. Then the next step up is brought about by the second stage of the Coniunctio. In this stage, the previously achieved unio mentalis is reunited with the body. Jung describes this operation in paragraphs 679 and 680 of, again, Rosarium Coniunctionis. Quote, the second stage of conjunction, the reuniting of the unio mentalis with the body, is particularly important, as only from here can the complete conjunction be attained, union with the unus mundus. The reuniting of the spiritual position with the body previously means that the insights gained should be made real. An insight might as well remain in abeyance if it is simply not used. The second stage of the conjunction, therefore, consists of making a reality of the man who has acquired some knowledge of his paradoxical wholeness. Okay. The great difficulty here, however, is that no one knows how the paradoxical wholeness of man can ever be realized. That is the crux of individuation, though it becomes a problem only when the loophole of scientific or other kinds of cynicism are not used. Because the realization of the wholeness that has been made conscious is an apparently insoluble task and faces the psychologist with questions which he can answer only with hesitation and uncertainty, it is of the greatest interest to see how the more unencumbered symbolical thinking of the medieval philosopher tackled this problem. So, now we're at level 2 on our way up, and at this level the ego has achieved the acceptance of the opposites and is able to endure the paradox of the psyche's two-sidedness. This brings into reality the insights that Jung describes in the passage just quoted. The event that then takes place is the third stage of the Coniunctio, the so-called union with the unus mundus. That leads one up to level 1, in which universal unity prevails. It represents a union of the ego with the self and with the world. Now the philosopher's stone, as the savior of the macrocosm, the great world, has been created. At this level, time and eternity are united, and synchronicity prevails. It is perfectly evident that this is a borderline state that one can only glimpse from afar. Once you are totally in it, you are out of the ego world as we know it. As the assumption is that final total translation to unity is consummated only at death. At best, that is, because death doesn't automatically bring it about either. Those are some of my thoughts about the symbolic implications of the Tetrakis and about how the three stages of the Coniunctio can be implied in the movement up and down the four numbers. There is another way of seeing it, and so this is the other way of seeing it. There's another way of seeing it, figure 23.5. Let me go through that to indicate what I have in mind. I'm again thinking of an initial descent down the four numbers, followed by an ascent up the four numbers. Stage 1 starts with the original state of oneness. Okay, so you can think of a baby who is just born, and it's one with itself, and it doesn't know any separation. And then think of how it becomes conscious, that baby. Stage 1 starts with the original state of oneness. The world, the body, the soul, and the spirit are all identified with one another. There's no distinction whatsoever. They all go to make up the original entity and don't yet exist separately. Okay, so this is the baby. In stage 2, the world gets separated off. Body, soul, and spirit remain a unity. So two entities exist. Stage 3, three entities exist. World and body get separated off. Soul and spirit remain united. And in stage 4, all four have been differentiated, but not in full consciousness. And he has a footnote here. It's interesting to note, and I'm not sure I can show that, but let me just see if I can. Okay, here it will be. So he says, it's interesting to note that in a slightly different formation, the same sequence can be seen in the Sephirotic tree, which is an idea in Judaism. I'm going to leave this one up on the screen for now, though. The operation of more complete differentiation requires another level of separation, which takes place in the ascending sequence. Soul and spirit unite in order to separate from the body and world more fully. That's the first stage of the Coniunctio, the unio mentalis. On the one hand, there's a higher level of separation, but on the other hand, it's the first step in a conscious synthesis. 4 items turn into 3 items. Then another synthesis takes place, the second stage of the Coniunctio, in which 3 items, world, body, and soul, spirit, turn into 2 items. Finally, the 2 items, world and world and body, soul, and spirit are synthesized, and the final result is the unus mundus. That's the third stage of the Coniunctio. I understand this is difficult. It's something that grows on you. You don't have to get it right away. The unio mentalis, the first step on the upward path, is both a union and a separation. One way of putting it is that the separation is between the body and the spirit, in that the state of the soul is still, in that state, the soul is still attached to the body. The second separation takes place between the body and the soul, with the soul then transferring its connection from the body to the spirit. Jung tries to describe that situation in paragraph 673, again of Mysterium Coniunctionis. Quote, since the soul animates the body, just as the soul is animated by the spirit, she tends to favor the body and everything bodily, sensuous, and emotional. She lies caught in the chains of physis, and she desires beyond physical necessity. She must be called back by the counsel of the spirit from her lostness in matter and the world. This is a relief to the body too, for it not only enjoys the advantage of being animated by the soul, but suffers under this disadvantage of having to serve as the instrument of the soul's appetites and desires. Her wish fantasies impel it to deeds to which it would not rouse itself without this incentive. For the inertia of matter is inborn in it and probably forms its only interest except for the satisfaction of physiological instincts. Hence, the separation means withdrawing the soul and her projections from the bodily sphere and from all environmental conditions relating to the body. In modern terms, it would be a turning away from sensuous reality, a withdrawal of the fantasy projections that give the 10,000 things their attractive and deceptive glamour. In other words, it means introversion, introspection, meditation, and a careful investigation of desires and their motives. How often we have the experience of being gripped by a material desire. Let me go back here. Just a second. Okay. How often we have the experience of being gripped by a material desire of some sort. A pair of shoes, a new hi-fi system, a television set, a new car, any one of the 10,000 things. One can be gripped by the desire for something, and if one goes after it unreflectingly, one may find that once one has it, the desire drops away, and the whole episode can be recognized as a piece of foolishness. One was caught by an illusion, a projection. The acquisition of the object didn't really satisfy because it wasn't really what was wanted. That would be an example of burdening the body. The body knows what material things it wants and needs, and if it gets what it needs, it will be satisfied. Okay, so then we get to this final conclusory statement, which I read at the beginning, but now I'll read it once more now that you have all this background. But the soul's purposes are symbolic ones, and if the soul slips up and makes the body serve these purposes, act them out literally, then there will be disappointment, okay, as there was for that fellow who wasn't out in his boat. Okay, experiences like that force one to reflect about the 10,000 things and their attractive and deceptive glamour. It leads then, in Jung's words, to introversion, introspection, meditation, and the careful investigation of desires and their motives. I should add that such experiences happen not only with things like shoes and cars and television sets, they also happen with personal relationship. One could get married on such a basis, you know. Marry in haste, repent at leisure. I want to end with Jung's important remarks in paragraph 667. Again, this is of Mysterium Coniunctionis. Quote, one should not be put off by the physical impossibilities of dogma or the Coniunctio, for they are symbols in regard to which the allurements of rationalism are entirely out of place and miss the mark. If symbols mean anything at all, they are tendencies which pursue a definite but not yet recognizable goal, and consequently can express themselves only in analogies. In this uncertain situation, one must be content to leave things as they are and give up trying to know anything beyond the symbol. In the case of dogma, such as a renunciation, such a renunciation is reinforced by the fear of possibly violating the sanctity of a religious idea, and in the case of alchemy, it was until very recently considered not worthwhile to rack one's brains over medieval absurdities. Today, armed with psychological understanding, we are in a position to penetrate into the meaning of even the most abstruse alchemical symbols, and there is no justifiable reason why we should not apply the same method to dogma. Nobody, after all, can deny that it consists of ideas which are born of man's imagining and thinking. The question of how far this thinking may be inspired by the Holy Ghost is not affected at all, let alone decided by psychological investigation, nor is the possibility of a metaphysical background denied. Psychology cannot advance any argument either for or against the objective validity of any metaphysical view. I have separated this statement in various places. I have repeated this statement in various places in order to give the lie to the obstinate and grotesque notion that a psychological explanation must necessarily be either a psychologism or its opposite, namely a metaphysical assertion. And here's the punchline. The psychic is a phenomenal world in itself, which can be reduced neither to the brain nor to metaphysics. That means, on the one hand, that the psyche cannot be explained by biochemistry, and on the other, that it cannot be explained by metaphysical, religious, dogmatic formulations of any brand or creed whatsoever. It is a separate world. It is a separate world of being, and the only reason attempts are made to explain it in terms of biochemistry or metaphysics is because the explainers who make the attempt are not aware of the existence, the reality of the psyche as a separate world of being. The very effort to explain it by those alternative means demonstrates that the psyche as a reality is invisible to the would-be explainers. And so that's the end of that. But the one thing I would add is that this morning I was reading in the latter part of Consilience by Edward O. Wilson. Now, Professor Wilson was one of the leading biology professors in the United States and the world, and he wrote this terrific book, Consilience, which is incredible in every way, except that he's doing exactly what Dr. Edinger describes here, which is he's trying to get back to some point in biology where he can point to, he calls it a culture image or something like that. He also calls it a pattern. He won't call it an archetype. and he talks about virtual reality existing in the mind. And I wanted to say, I was listening to it on audio, and I wanted to say to him, you mean the psyche? but anyway, that's for a discussion with one of my friends here at a later time. So let me go back and see what your comments are. I have a few more minutes. But this sounds like a kind of synthesis. And Martin, introverted thinking and extroverted intuition are introverted sensing memory, systems thinking. Fascinating, Martin. Yeah, I guess I have to work through that, but that is a synchronicity. As I was thinking of asking about that tree, the Sephiroth tree. I got the tree when meditating on Metatron's cube. It became present in my consciousness. Martin says, I slightly crossed my eyes and another tree popped out of a flat image on the cube in a third effect. And Buzz says, amazing, the mind is doing much more than we realize. Martin says, it seems it was handed to me and urged by higher self. And Buzz says, I always forgot to record dreams or meditative experiences, then occasionally they pop back into the mind. Strange. Well, it's very useful to keep a journal of your dreams and visions, and I have taken to doing it because I do believe that dreams and visions are intentional messages from the psyche that we need to pay attention to. And they're often synchronous, among other things. So, anyway, I hope that wasn't too much, but I at least got through image number 1. And so I'm going to come back to image number 1 now, just for a moment. This is a different version of image number 1. And just remind you that this is the picture number 1 from the Rosarium Philosophorum, one of the 10 pictures that we're discussing within the context of this book, The Mystery of the Coniunctio, Alchemical Image of Individuation. And as Dr. Edinger says, this is these 10 images represent basic psychological process from beginning to end. And so today's video has mainly been about this image, which symbolically represents all the things that we were talking about, which are quite complex. You know, it gets, even for me, it gets me hypnotic a couple times there in that reading. I'm trying to keep my eyes open because the ideas are so intense. But ultimately, you can see in this image the axiom of Maria, which is 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, blah, blah, blah. And so you can see what the alchemists were saying to one another, and obviously this was sort of a reminder of how these things work and come together. And so that's the first image, and in the next few days I'll complete the other images. Yeah, and you probably need to watch multiple times in order to remember this. I remember the first time I read through this similar material. It wasn't this particular book, but it was about these images. And I remember being quite fascinated by it, but it didn't really stick. And so now it's starting to stick and helping me understand where it fits into the individuation process. So anyway, I am going to discontinue now, and I will come back to you tomorrow probably. Martin says, sounds odd, but I stood before a council during meditation in which I was given information in another language that was not of Earth. That could easily happen, and I do not, I intentionally do not comment on interpreting other people's dreams and visions, so I'm not going to go into it more than that. Martin says, I thought in my mind I was fully lucid, and the head talked over me. And as I talked, the head talked over me. Okay, I'm not going to comment. I'm going to resist commenting. I'm not a mental health professional, and so I try to resist the idea of commenting on other people's dreams and visions. But ultimately, you need to assess these images for yourself, because they are all symbolic, and no matter what you tell to me or anyone else, it's only what you think about that image that makes any difference. It doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. So peace. See you again soon, and thank you for joining me today.